It's my pleasure. So I'm Geneva, everybody, and thanks for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for the evening, Charles Card. For more than 4 decades, Charles has pursued the implications of the Jung-Pauli collaboration and von Franz's work on number archetypes. He's presented and been invited to lectures at the University of Helsinki, the Assisi Conference in Vermont, as well as towards the Science of Consciousness conferences in Helsinki and Tucson. His writings have been published in the journals of Psychological Perspectives, Mind and Matter, and the Journal of Humanistic Mathematics, and in various essay collections and conference proceedings. From 1980 to his retirement in 2016, he was instructor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Victoria. His formal studies were undertaken at UVic, Reed College, and the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He's also a founding member of the Young Society of Victoria, and currently sits on the board for our society. So thank you so much, Charles, for preparing this for us today. And I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks so much for coming.
All right. Welcome. Please hop on board. The presentation tonight will be undertaken in the spirit of a tour bus, moving for the next 2 hours rapidly past many fascinating sites, any one of which is worthy of a much deeper investigation. I hope you will enjoy this all too brief tour. 3 years ago, I gave an initial presentation of the story of synchronicity, and at that time I went into great detail, perhaps excruciating detail, to tell that story. I have no intention to make such a deep dive again tonight, but it'll be necessary to go back over some of what I covered at that time. The presentation tonight will be in 3 parts, each about a half hour long. First, I will briefly review the origin of the synchronicity concept itself, and then take our first short question period and break about 5 minutes. Then I will move on beyond synchronicity to the various streams of thought in philosophy, quantum physics, biology, and complex systems that have issued forth from it for more than 7 decades. After a second short 5-minute question period and break, I will tell you a story of love and betrayal, of a gift refused and a gift honored, and finally, a tale of a tragic death. The origin of the synchronicity concept is a story of dreams, of intuitions, and of ideas. So it is also a story of the people who dreamt and intuited and shared and worked together to bring forth the synchronicity concept. While considerable attention will be devoted to the collaboration of Jung with Wolfgang Pauli, I will also bring into focus the role of Marie-Louise von Franz, both as a timely and significant collaborator with Jung on the one hand, and as an insightful inspiratrice for Pauli on the other. Thus, there's a triad of relationships that I will explore. However, when a triad is at work, it is often the case that behind the scenes there's a quaternity present as well. And that seems to be the case here. So I will introduce a fourth person who has played a very significant role in bringing forth our present understanding of the origin of the synchronicity concept. That person is C.A. or Carl Alfred Meier. Meier was born in Schaffhausen, Switzerland in 1905. He met Jung when he was 18, and soon after meeting Jung, he began his studies for a medical degree earned at the University of Zurich. Then he worked closely with Jung, with Tony Wolff and Emma Jung. He went on to hold the chair of honorary professor of psychology at the ETH, that's the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, following Jung's footsteps. He was the first president of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich. And after the Jung-Pauli correspondence became accessible in 1987, Meier began editing it with its first publication in German in 1992 and the English translation that followed in 2001. Meier died in 1995. A very large part of the story that I'm talking about tonight has been made possible by his work. So let's visit Carl Jung in midstream. Here he is in 1930. He's 55 years of age. He's in his midlife. He has a very substantial body of work already behind him. In that work, you'll find many of the familiar concepts of analytical psychology, the concepts of personal, collective, unconscious, complex archetypes, shadow, great mother, great father, animus, anima, the self, the four personality types, and so on. And then he also had his personal writings, the Black Books and the Red Book. These are, of course, not available to us until very recently. And it's not clear that Jung would even have wanted them published, but now they're in our libraries. Here's the Red Book. And in the epilogue of the Red Book, there's a very interesting statement dated 1959. It says, I worked on this book for 16 years. My acquaintance with alchemy in 1930 took me away from it. The beginning of the end came in 1928 when Wilhelm sent me the text of the Golden Flower, an alchemical treatise. Okay, so that was when Jung would leave the interior exploration that he'd been on for, well, more than 16 years and enter into the study of alchemy, and in doing so to engage the notion of the unus mundus, the one world, that would characterize the next half of his creative life. Here's a list of his major works from 1930 onward. And if you go to Psychology and Religion, 1938, from that volume and from the ones that followed, there is a presence of the influence of one person. Of course, you had many influences, but one person either colored or significantly influenced much of what would be created and written by Jung for the rest of his life. And that one person was Wolfgang Pauli. This is Pauli. He was born in Vienna in 1900. His mother, Bertha, but she was known at home as Maria. She was an intellectual, a socialist, a feminist. She studied literature, especially drama. Pauli's father was also Wolfgang, and his family given name was Paschals. And he initially studied medicine at Karl Ferdinand University in Prague. In 1892, the family moved from Prague to Vienna, and the family name was changed from Paschals to Pauli, and they converted from Judaism to Catholicism. Pauli's father became a professor at the University of Vienna and later became the director of a new institute there for medical colloid chemistry. In 1911, Pauli's family left the Catholic Church and were baptized as evangelists. And Pauli was unaware of his Jewish roots until he was 16 years old. Here's a little collection of photographs of Pauli throughout his childhood. By the time he had arrived at age 19, he was off to university. Now, at home with him was a sister who came 6 years after his birth, Hertha. And Pauli felt shocked and displaced when Hertha was born. And in correspondence with Jung, he would say he marked her arrival as the birth of his anima. Jung would respond to Pauli that he felt he had an infantile fixation on his sister and stated that Pauli fell in love with women who resembled his sister, that she had to give her blessing to the woman that he chose, and Pauli, for his part, resented her for marrying. Herta went on to become an actress at 18. She went off to Breslau and to the Max Reinhardt theaters in Germany until 1933. She collaborated on film and radio projects, wrote plays, acted as a literary agent, and then moved from Berlin to Vienna to Paris, finally fleeing to the US in 1940. Now, there was another very significant person in the Pauli household, and that's Ernst Mach. Ernst Mach was the godfather to both Wolfgang and Hertha, and thus they acquired their middle name from his. But he was also a preeminent philosopher of science at that time. What a person to have in your household. Pauli's father was a friend of Ernst Mach's son, Ludwig. And so that's how they met. They met Ludwig and Ernst. Ludwig was Ernst's son, and Ludwig and Pauli's father met as students in Prague. And then the elder Mach became teacher and fatherly friend to Pauli's father. And the friendship continued as both men relocated to Vienna. At the time of Pauli's childhood, Mach held a professorship at the University of Vienna, one specializing in his particular area of the philosophy of science. Mach called it universal phenomenology, and in his work, in his philosophical work, he would characterize sensory impressions as a psychophysical flow. That term would be used again by Pauli much later in his life, and with slightly different meaning, but he would have been hearing about psychophysical flow and psychophysically neutral aspects at a very young age, right in his household. Pauli had been raised to be a critical thinker, but he did not accept Mach's or his father's judgments unreservedly. It's curious that Ernst Mach was also very influential on Albert Einstein as Einstein was formulating his first special theory of relativity. So at the age of just over 18, Pauli goes off to the University of Munich to begin studies. Before he even arrives there, he has pretty much in hand 3 essays on general relativity. Now, how could that be possible? Einstein had only written his theory of general relativity, that's his second theory, in 1915. Somehow this 15 to 18-year-old boy, Pauli, had managed to write an authoritative set of essays on Einstein's second theory. When he arrived at the University of Munich, his supervisor, Arnold Sommerfeld, found that Pauli was so gifted that he had nothing to learn from him. So what's he to do? Sommerfeld asks Pauli to write an encyclopedia article, and that would eventually become a 250-page book that Einstein praised when he read it. Pauli had to sit in his chair at Munich for 6 semesters. That was required. He would graduate in 1921. Okay. But what did he graduate with? Not what we would call a bachelor's degree. He graduated with his PhD earned in 1921. So he would go on then, leaving Munich and go to Göttingen University, study and work with Max Born. And then in 1922, he would meet up with the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who would invite him to his institute in Copenhagen. That was to become a lifelong and extremely meaningful relationship between those two men. Pauli would go to work with Wilhelm Lenz at Hamburg University, and then back to Copenhagen for a year in 1922-23. By 1924, Pauli would be granted his first sort of elementary level of professorship at the University of Hamburg. And already now, 24 years old, he would formulate the exclusion principle that would bear his name, the Pauli exclusion principle, that for which he'd received the Nobel Prize in 1945. It's so amazing that a 24-year-old would have accomplished this. So he remained at Hamburg but stayed very close to Niels Bohr, also to Werner Heisenberg, who was a young um, physics doctoral student at that time with Bohr. And he would be very familiar with the Bohr Institute in Copenhagen. Then in the summer of 1927, Bohr and Pauli and Heisenberg would formulate the Copenhagen interpretation, named after, of course, the town the city where they were all working together. So, what is the Copenhagen interpretation? It's an interpretation of the mathematical structure of quantum theory. That's the theory that was being developed of atomic processes and smaller such things. The Copenhagen interpretation introduces a great deal of the so-called weirdness of the physics of the atom. It introduces notions of probability, of indeterminability, of complementarity, of something called entanglement that you may have heard of over the years as part of the very, very strange behavior of the physics of the atom and of elementary particles. But although, though it's primarily focused on the physics of the very small, it actually holds for all scales in the universe. It's a very radical departure from the world as Newton described it, and even as Einstein described it. Pauli would go on to Zurich to have a full professorship at the ETH in Zurich. He's there in 1928. He's now a premier institute of technology, and he is very well established in his professional life. But we need to look at his personal life. From the time he was a child, he was very precocious. He was an enfant terrible. He was quick to find flaws in logical and mathematical reasoning, was a very skeptical and sharp-tongued, sarcastic-witted individual. People would call him Pauli the Terrible or God's Whip when they felt his criticism. But he was so well respected by his peers that even though he was terribly critical, they knew that he was acting in a conscientious way. So he was the conscience of physics. In 1962, Niels Bohr would write about Pauli. He would say Pauli was not only disrespectful, that he was very much. He also projected a very special lucidity of thought and a very special intellectual honesty. And that's how people put up with him, because he was very, very special. He was also very special for the Pauli effect. He had this very unusual association with the catastrophic failure of lab equipment. If he walked into a physics lab, even if he had his hands in his pocket, he would come into the lab and something would break, something would fail in the experiment at hand. And even hard-bitten physicists of the day, no nonsense people, would bar him from even entering the lab because they knew, because of what they called the Pauli effect, that they would have some catastrophic failure associated with that, his presence. Now, Pauli's adult life would also have in it a era of crisis. When he was at Hamburg, when he was that young fellow in Hamburg, he already had a Jekyll and Hyde sort of existence. That he was on one hand a brilliant, famous conscience of physics, and on the other hand an alcoholic ruffian frequenting bars and getting into fights. And he felt lonely and paranoid. Things got worse for him in 1927. His mother died. She had been suffering from pneumonia, and it's suggested that she may have, in fact, overdosed on the medicines at the time. that she was taking, and died as a result. Um, his father, was already in an adulterous relationship at that time, and when his wife died, he would marry the young woman who was, in fact, Pauli's age. In 1929, he left the Catholic Church, and in December, he married a vaudeville dancer, Kitta Deppner. And that didn't last long. She would leave him just a couple months after they had married, and they would divorce less than a year later. So Pauli became severely depressed, and he developed, in an associated way, a deep phobia of wasps. So Pauli goes off to on a lecture tour in North America, and he arrives at the University of Michigan, and he gets very drunk, and he falls downstairs, and he breaks his shoulder. So he has to finish the lecture tour in a cast and situation, as you see in the photograph. His father says, as well as friend, says, "Enough's enough. You need to get some help," and suggested that he see Jung. And he did. Pauli went for a 20-minute interview with Jung, and Jung arranged for Pauli to be seen by Dr. Erna Rosenbaum. Erna Rosenbaum had studied medicine in Munich and Berlin before studying with Jung in Zurich. She had arrived in October 1931, and she just stayed 9 months with Jung to have a training analysis and to attend Jung's German and English seminar. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of an introductory letter that Pauli wrote to Rosenbaum and asking for a meeting with her. It's sort of characteristic of Pauli at that time, this young 32-year-old man. He says, the background is that I consulted Mr. Jung a week ago because of some neurotic symptoms, which, among other things, had to do with the fact that it is easier for me to achieve success in academia than with women. Since for Mr. Jung the opposite is the case, he seemed the right person to ask for medical advice. My surprise was not little when Mr. Jung explained to me that this was not so, and it would be imperative for me to be in treatment with a woman, for I am very sensitive and very distrustful vis-a-vis women, and thus I am somewhat doubtful about this. Anyway, he is accepted by Rosenbaum, and she meets with him for the next 8 months. In that period, he will have recorded and shared 400 dreams. And Rosenbaum did not carry out analysis with him, but just merely received the dreams and had initial discussions with him. She would leave, and Pauli would Jung would take up the next 2 months in meeting with Pauli. But even Jung did not analyze the dreams at that time. Pauli would record another 60 dreams to the end of 1932. So in total, there were 460 dreams in a 10-month period and 72 drawings. Pauli would see Jung until October 1934, when he discontinued his analysis. Why did he discontinue his analysis? Well, part of it was he got remarried. He had met Franca Bertram in 1933 through the agency of a friend, and they would marry in 1934. And Pauli would end his analysis with Jung. Jung would say that Pauli was able to take up a completely normal life, I suppose. On the surface, certainly that seemed to be the case. Here's a picture now of Pauli's father with Pauli's wife, Franca, in 1936. So there is somewhat of a re-engagement with the father, and they did live in all appearances a normal life in the outskirts of Zurich. So in that whole stretch of Jung's association with Pauli, Pauli would share a great number of dreams with him. Throughout the 30s, the number of dreams were totaled to 860. Then World War II came up, and their ability to communicate was very shortened, and so there were only 36 dreams shared in the 1940s, 83 in the 1950s, and then quite a number of letters in the correspondence, some 315 letters. Now, it is thanks to the very careful work of Carl von Mayen that both the full correspondence of Pauli's with all of his friends, it's an immense work. Carl von Mayen has assembled those, and they haven't been translated in total into English, but they are together as a German language resource. And then he also has published Pauli's complete dream material. And so that's another very notable contributor to the Jung-Pauli collaboration. Okay, so Pauli has given Jung permission to move ahead on analyzing and discussing his dreams in print. Just don't mention my name, basically was the rule, and he didn't. Pauli's name did not come up in Jung's writings, but he was the subject of the Aranis lecture of 1935, the Tavistock lectures of 35, the Bailey Island lectures in 36, the New York City and the Terry lectures at Yale in 1937, and then a large quotient of them became the subject matter of Psychology and Alchemy in 1943. I'm going to spend just a minute to go through the dream content in a very brief way. I just want to give you a smell of it, if you will. It will play a role in what we'll learn as we go through the development of synchronicity. So what Jung was seeing in Pauli's dreams were mandalic symmetry, also alchemical symbology. There is some references to circular movement, often in the dreams, rotating stars and globes. There's quaternic structures and squares and precious jewels and diamonds and so forth. Perhaps more significantly is than the images that are coming up, there is the progression of the dream series, which the images are providing. And the dream series themselves largely resides with the development of Pauli's anima. At first, Pauli had almost no anima presence in his dreams. They were just a diffuse multiplicity. They were nymphs and vague female forms. At one point, a singular unknown dark woman appears. She has a veil, and then when the veil is lifted, she has a face like the sun. She'll eventually take her place in a quaternio, first as a silent doll woman, and then when she begins to speak, she reproaches him for neglecting her. Eventually, she becomes a guide for him and even becomes pregnant. Her development is crucial for him, for the dreamer, Pauli, to find a center for himself and to square his surroundings. In that first set of 460 dream images, they're kind of let's put it this way, the capstone of what he produced in that first 10 months of shared dreams and discussion was this image. The image on the left is his drawing. The image on the right is an artistic rendering of what Pauli was imagining. It's called referred to as the Great World Clock, and it is clearly mandalic in its theme. Okay, so correspondence between Jung and Pauli begins. Right as the last few meetings for the analytical process take place. Pauli withdraws from analysis. He learns something about his wasp phobia and how it relates to his anima issues. He's also having something that will play a role significantly later in his work on synchronicity. He's starting to have dreams that contain physical terminology and imagery, and he's making even a lexicon, a list of terms and images as these come up in his dreams. And his dark anima has progressed in its development to become a Chinese woman with a certain erotic kind of nature for him. In 1937, he notes that there's even more of this kind of representation of physical apparatus and themes coming up in psychic processes. So this continues to catch his interest, and he indicates that by 1938 he is already doing some of the background reading that would characterize his work on the Kepler flood essay that he would later publish along with Jung's essay on synchronicity. So he's got an early start for this material. It's up to 1939, and things are looking pretty severe in even living in Switzerland. So he's preparing to leave for the US. There's his passport photo. So in 1940, he's off to Princeton. He's off to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. So he'll spend the war years there. In the meantime, and through that war years, little is known because of the imposed silences on communication, but we know that in 1944, Jung has his first heart attack. In 1945, Pauli is told that he will be awarded the Nobel Prize for the exclusion principle. He doesn't receive this till 1946. Strangely enough, Pauli had been an individual without a country up until that point. He did not have Swiss citizenship. Finally, he had applied earlier for US citizenship, but turned down, and then eventually, I guess thanks to having a Nobel Prize award, he was granted US citizenship, and the Swiss did finally award him citizenship in 1949. World War II ends, and Pauli returns to Zurich to the ETH. Okay, and when he does that, he resumes his correspondence and at times meetings with Jung. So he indicates that his work on the Kepler and flood essay that he's developing is progressing, and Jung asks Pauli to become a sponsor for the Jung Institute that is just being put together at that time. The Kepler flood essay that Pauli is providing or working on actually gets presented for the first time in March of 1948. And also at that time, Pauli has enclosed to Jung a significant, never published essay until C.A. Meier publishes it with the correspondence, but that's a very notable essay called Modern Examples of Background Physics. So we're at the point where synchronicity is born conceptually and in a reality, let's put it that way. Now, Jung had already used the term synchronicity in 1930. He'd used the term synchronistic earlier than that, 1928. But now at the table, Jung and Pauli would talk about synchronicity. And it's interesting that Pauli notes at that time that and 2 years earlier, 1946, all of these major notions that he would bring then to the table in the synchronicity discussion were already present. He had his Kepler lecture notion. He had this idea of a psychophysically neutral language, archetypal background to physical terms. All of them were present in 1946. Now, I won't go through this in great detail, but the synchronicity manuscript would actually go through a first draft and then a revision. Pauli, being the sublime critic for Jung, of course, reacted to the content of the manuscript and didn't pull any punches with Jung to criticize what was there. He criticized this parapsychological experiment, the Rhine experiment, as maybe not suitable in the context of synchronicity. He suggested that the astrological experiment that Jung had subjected to statistical analysis was not appropriate. He said, look at Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer has already written about synchronicity. But the biggest thing Pauli did was to say, look, your use of the concept of time is incorrect. Instead of pointing to a correspondence at an instant of time, a simultaneous arrival of a mental and physical event at one instant of time, he says you should look at the correspondence of meaning. So Pauli had already been talking about a meaning correspondence even when he was in Princeton, New Jersey during World War II, and he tells Jung that, and Jung changes his terminology to meaningful coincidence. So a revised manuscript is written. It's returned to Pauli. Pauli will argue again with some of Jung's uses. One of the biggest things for Pauli was that Jung put synchronicity under a very broad umbrella in which he combined all kinds of coincidences. Coincidence of two psychic states, for example. Coincidence of a psychic and a non-psychic event. That's what we know of as synchronicity in kind of a narrow sense. But then there was also a coincidence of two non-psychic events also under that umbrella. And Pauli doesn't quite know what to make of it, but after considering the pros and cons, he accepts Jung's broader, more inclusive definition of synchronicity. He notes that the concept of archetype has a natural relationship to the concept of probability as it comes up in quantum mechanics. But the quantum mechanical phenomena are not synchronistic phenomena in the narrow sense anyway. They might be under the same umbrella, under Jung's broad umbrella, but they're not the same as synchronicity in a narrow sense. But Pauli does finally kind of back off of a hard stance on that, and he accepts that Jung wants to talk about both types of synchronicity at the same time. The manuscript has gone back and forth. They've had their final exchanges. Jung will finally present a lecture on synchronicity in 1951 in the winter, January and February of 1951. Pauli has done his work through the manuscript and returns it to Jung. And Pauli also finishes off his Kepler essay and encloses it later on in April. And both of those together, the synchronicity essay and Pauli's Kepler essay, are published together in Naturerklärung und Psyche in 1952. Now, the two men continued to meet in the years that followed, and they had this a convergence. They got closer and closer to an understanding of something that had been pointed to by Pauli first, but then Jung also saw it, that one could potentially develop a psychophysically neutral language, an archetypal language, put it that way, that would allow one to describe synchronistic phenomena in a meaningful way, and in fact, perhaps in an even broader use for it. Jung had formulated the notion of psychoid to try to get at the same idea of how one it can extend beyond the notion of physical, beyond the notion of psyche into some land, some psychophysically neutral area, and that possibly archetypes could be a language for exploring the psychoid nature. So he talks now, by that time, 1953, he's talking about the psychoid nature of archetypes, and that there is a matrix which becomes identified as the unus mundus, the physical and psychic matrix is identical. Okay. So to try to wrap up all of the different ideas that these two had wrestled with, and they had wrestled in a very serious and meaningful way. And when I say wrestle, probably I shouldn't use that term. They had gave birth to the synchronicity concept, and they knew they were doing that, and they struggled to be clear, and they never felt that they had achieved a final work through the concept, that it was, in a sense, the synchronicity concept as it emerged was still an infant, a child for them. And much more would have to come to clarify what it was. But I summarized the major points of their work as an archetypal hypothesis. Let me just read them for you, then we're going to take a break soon. So the realms of mind and matter, of psyche and physis, are complementary aspects of the same transcendental reality, the unus mundus. Archetypes act as the fundamental dynamical patterns whose various representations characterize all processes, whether mental or physical. In the realms of the psyche, archetypes organize images and ideas. In the realms of physis, they organize the structure and transformations of matter and energy, and they account for acausal orderedness as well. Archetypes acting in both of these realms together of psyche and physis, where meaningful coincidence account for instances of synchronistic phenomena. So that's where synchronicity comes in. And finally, they had arrived at an understanding that a psychophysically neutral language might be possible to develop that would be capable of providing a highly unified description of reality, both in its physical and mental aspects. All right, thanks for bearing with me. Let's take a minute, 5 minutes at least, for a first break. So you had a great lead-in question. What we're going to do now is to explore how the archetypal hypothesis, that list of points that I just read to you, gets expanded upon over the next 70 years. So I look at it as a succession of waves. The first wave coming with the work of Jung and Pauli and their initial discussions of synchronicity. So, of course, they were talking with each other. They were talking with their friends and associates. Of course, Marie-Louise von Franz right there, C.A. Meier right there, collaborated with both men. They would speak to the Psychological Club, the Aranus conferences, and other sort of conference attendees. Pauli had his friends and students that he shared some of the content with. There were other interesting scholars at the time on the scene. So that was the first wave, and it ran from approximately 1950 to just very approximately 1980. In 1980, the second wave sort of started to roll through. They were, the people who were in the second wave were scavenging what they could off of what was in the first wave, which was very, very meager. Why was it meager? Because the correspondence between Jung and Pauli was kept closeted. Pauli's wife, his widow at that time, did not want any release of that correspondence, nor did the people at the institute called CERN, where they had the Pauli collection there, some of his correspondence, they did not want this to leave the premises. One had to scratch for source material. Things started to change in about 1985. Laura Kynan um, removed or quoted from some of the material at the CERN repository without permission and violating their sanctions against it. And he wrote about what he had read, some of the correspondence. And that brought a fair amount of criticism on him, but it also, thankfully, for people like myself, opened the door up on the discussion. And then in 1992, there was just a sharp, a very sharp date. July 1992, the floodgates opened. Meier published the German language initial version of the correspondence between Pauli and Jung. You can see that on the right there. And what a change that made at that time. Now you weren't scratching for bits and pieces. There was just so much material there. So there was a third wave that rolled through from 1992, let's say, to approximately 2000, where a lot of scholarly activity took place at a level and a depth, intensity that had not been possible before. Several people were able to earn their PhDs off of that work, including Susan Gieser and Marie-Louise Donati, both earned PhDs in history and philosophy of science looking at that material. Susan Gieser actually had been on site from the mid 80s. She had gained permission to read various large deposits of the correspondence, and she built her dissertation upon that. But you know, the writing of a dissertation and the defense of it and so forth is a very long process. And this topic is not without its, questions and controversies. So it wasn't until after 2000 that an English language version of her, what would be built out of her PhD dissertation was published. Okay, so a fourth wave rolled out then roughly from 2000 to the present time, and just a huge number of individuals have made use of the material and commented and extended it. The areas that have been explored included philosophy in itself, looking at what is the question of meaning? What does it mean to have meaningful coincidences? What are we talking about there? And also, there's that notion of a unus mundus as an archetype. We can talk about it, but what does it mean in the realm of philosophy when we look at the ground of being and becoming? Quantum philosophy also needs to be explored with this issue. And in science proper, quantum physics gets explored, biology, complex systems, numerical cognition, all become engaged with the areas that are explored in synchronicity. Okay, so no time to discuss anything but just a very, very small handful. I'm going to, on the second wave of writers and researchers, I'm going to discuss F. David Peat, third wave, Harold Atmanspacher, Susanne Gieser, and the fourth wave, a little bit about Tamain and Cambray's contribution. Okay, let's get on to F. David Peat. Now, I have a particular fondness for F. David Peat because, 51 years ago, I would listen to CBC Ideas program, and Ideas was every night of the week. But I believe on Friday nights, they ran this series that F. David Peat and Paul Buckley had put together on on physics and premier physicists. They did interviews with Heisenberg and with Wheeler and with Bohm and with many other. Oh, I was gobsmacked, as they say, to hear this coming. So that's how I first knew F. David Pete. Um, and then in the mid '80s, I find his first book on synchronicity. He had published in 1985 a book um, before he had entered the land of Jung, and I had entered that as well. So I was just enamored with F. David Pete. Let me tell you a bit about him. He studied at Liverpool University, where he received a PhD in physics in 1964. Then he came to Canada and went to Queen's University, worked there from 65 to 67. From 67 on to 75, he worked at the National Research Council in Ottawa. He took a sabbatical in 1971 to 72. He went to London to Birkbeck College to study with and work with David Bohm and Roger Penrose. And then after finishing his work at the National Research Council, from 1975 on to his death, he would become an independent and a prolific researcher, writer, and consultant, and also an organizer of things. And he had fallen in love with Italy, with Tuscany. He found this little village called Pari up in the hills of Tuscany, about 40 kilometers from Siena. And he said, "This is where I want to create a site." He called it Pari Center, which would become a retreat for studying these subjects of interest with him. And in a sense, he saw it as an alchemical vessel where there could be this quiet gestation of ideas, and the cooking, uh, alchemical cooking of those ideas. The ideas that he explored are the four that I've listed there: physics and philosophy of David Bohm, Jung Pauli collaboration, indigenous ways of knowing, and something called gentle action. And he wove them all together. They're not separate at all. But first, I'll talk about David Bohm. If you saw, excuse me, if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, you may that was just hugely Academy Award winning film a couple of years ago now. You saw in it that there was a graduate student of Robert Oppenheimer, an unidentified graduate student that was involved with the Communist Party of the day. They were at Berkeley. Bohm was there. Now that composite of the graduate student was largely taken from the life or the being of David Bohm. He was an American physicist who earned his PhD from Berkeley in 1943. He was a student of Robert Oppenheimer. He went on to teach and work at Princeton, and he worked closely with Albert Einstein until about 1950, when he was arrested. He was arrested for refusing to testify for the House Un-American Activities Committee. He took the Fifth Amendment. Sorry, he didn't want to testify against friends who the McCarthy era folk wanted to know about. So he was acquitted from the charges against him in 1951, but from that point on, he was out of work and unemployable in the US. So he went to Brazil first, worked there for several years, then to Israel, and then to the UK, where he finally took up a position at Birkbeck College at the University of London in 1961. Now, Bohm had studied with Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer had studied with Pauli. But Bohm did not accept Pauli's Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, quantum mechanics. So he developed an alternative. In 1952, he published something that was called the causal interpretation. It was something that he worked on with a close colleague. You see him down in the lower right-hand picture there on the page. a fellow named Basil Hiley. So Bowman Hiley worked on this alternate interpretation of quantum physics for many years. It was modified and reformulated in 1980, and then once again in 1993. It was given a different name, ontological interpretation. It was in this process, it was reconceptualized and broadened to include all kinds of um, wider issues, wider questions. He was getting into something called the explicate order and implicate order, something called the Hola movement, in which the uh, the role of language was to come into play. Bohm had felt that, in fact, we were shortchanged in our language, in the way we use our language to talk about matter and even about consciousness. So he said we need a process language to talk about these things. So he developed or tried to develop a common ground for process language. He called it the real mode. Now, F. David Pete was certainly immersed in Bohm's world. Uh, and being in Bohm's world, you couldn't use Pauli's sort of entryway to synchronicity through his work in quantum physics. So uh, F. David Pete had to find another door into physics, so to speak, and he did it through something called chaos theory. Now, a more dignified name for chaos theory is nonlinear dynamical systems, and what that really is about is a way of using computers, which were available for the first time at such a quality that they could be used to look at immense systems and hugely interrelated systems where feedback and self-reference were ongoing. And that's where the notion of chaos came in. Let me try to just explain a little bit about that. Imagine you're out uh, in the air and there's the most gentle breeze blowing by, very, very gentle breeze. Well, from a physics point of view, you can um, imagine a feather blowing along through the breeze, and it would be describable very easy in terms of the physics of this slowly moving breeze. But let's say you pick up the speed of the wind and the feather moves faster. And okay, not a problem at this point. But let's say it begins to really blow. Then trying to follow that feather, the motion of that feather becomes almost impossible. And then let's say you get up to almost hurricane force winds. Okay. You get up to a place where even the slightest more energy put into the wind system will set loose now a turbulent motion for the air, and you can form a tornado from even the tiniest little bit of extra energy. So people call this the butterfly effect, and what they're referring to is even the motion of the wings of a butterfly can add the extra energy to provoke a tornado. That's a nice little metaphor for what is happening in when you have a chaotic onset of chaos in a system. Um, this is generalizable in many different systems. You can look at it as in a system of flowing water. Where does turbulence set in? Where does a whirlpool set in water? And many other circumstances. So in the 80s, chaos theory was hot. It was very interesting and caught people's imagination. It caught Pete's imagination, and he took from chaos theory what he wanted to use to explicate the Jung-Pauli archetypal hypothesis. He said what we talk about in Jungian terms as an unus mundus is really in physics terms is a nonlinear dynamical system, a chaotic system, or a system that could move to chaos. What we talk about as archetypes can be seen as implicate order, dynamical patterns. What we talk about as meaning can be seen as symmetries in the dynamical patterns that are produced in that system. So he developed a common language, a bridging language that allowed him to approach synchronicity through a different door of physics than Pauli had entered. Now, remember, Pete was in Canada, and he took the opportunity to meet quite a number of Indigenous folk in Canada and get to know them and their myths and their way of looking at their own physics. And he also went to Australia and talked with Indigenous folks there. And so that was a big part of his interests as well, the Indigenous ways of knowing the world, and to get that an additional alternative perspective on how the world works. He also took an interest in what I would call a blend of Taoist, Zen Buddhist, and indigenous philosophy that he called gentle action. And that involved notions of what he would say was creative suspension and unfolding intention. In other words, almost a meditative practice instead of moving directly and forcefully onto a subject that one, in fact, pulls back and suspends one's motion into it and has a meditative experience around it. So that's what David Pete was about, and that's what the Perry Center still is about in Italy. Next person I want to discuss is Suzanne Gieser. I told you that she was doing her PhD research already from the mid-'80s. She had become interested in Jung's work in early '80s. She went on to write these two very, very, very fine books. This was the one on the left is The Innermost Kernel is basically taken from her PhD dissertation work. And then the one on the right just came out a few years ago, a few meaning 2019. It's a beautiful rendering of Jung's essays, or Jung's seminars given at Bailey Island, Maine, and in New York City at that time in 1937, 1938. Both just wonderful resources for this subject. Okay, another one and a huge contributor is Harold Ottmanspacher. If you look at his academic portfolio, look at that, 200 papers and 17 books. Much of that suitable for either direct discussion or imported discussion into the topic of synchronicity and related topics. And now, who is he? Well, right now he's the chair of philosophy at ETH. So what a journey to get there he's taken. It's amazing. He's given more than 500 presentations in over the decades, and he's also the editor of Mind and Matter Journal and involved with other journals as well. He has brought, let's say, respectability to the discussion of synchronicity in the physics colloquium room. Okay, the physics or philosophy room, the philosophers would speak of a dual aspect monism rather than an unus monadus, and so that's how he's formulated the discussion, and he's pursued other aspects of synchronicity, and even looked at how it might be possible to have an embracive a single understanding of how both mind and matter might be related to each other on a deep level that would allow some discussion by physicists in that process. So just to recap on him, he in the mid 90s, he revisited the Jung-Pauli collaboration once all of the correspondence was available. He represented the onus mundus as dual aspect monism, and he's pursued the issue of what meaning means, in other words, the deep structure of meaning. And then with a physicist named Chris Fuchs, he has formulated the Pauli-Jung conjecture that allows him to actually make a quantum inspired model of the dual aspect monism. Okay, now moving on to yet another individual who has been able to bring Jung back into the university is Roderick Mayne. He's at University of Essex, and he is a professor in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies, director of the Center for Myth Studies. It's a real rarity in a university environment. His PhD work was published in the mid to late 1990s, so that his work in 1997 came out around that time, Jung on Synchronicity and the Paranormal. And he's had a number of other publications since then, and including a most recent one on Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment, which came out in 2022. He's perhaps one of the most readable scholarly writers for exploring synchronicity, if you want to dive into it there. Now, he made use, even in his PhD studies, he made use of the work of Robert Aziz's work on meaning, synchronistic meaning. Now, Aziz was a depth psychologist in Ontario who published work in the early 90s on synchronicity, and Roderick Mayne made use of his work. And he's also looked at the notion of the re-enchantment of the world through Jungian individuation. Another person that is very much involved with that fourth wave of response to synchronicity is Joe Cambray. He's past president of the Pacifica. He's a faculty member, was a faculty member at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital, Department of Psychiatry. He was president of the C.G. Jung Institute in Boston. And this collection, or essay collection, I guess you could say, that he wrote called Synchronicity, Nature and Psyche in an Interconnected Universe, has been quite influential in recent discussions. What he has done, he's sort of taken the same move that Pete took by going to chaos theory, or complex adaptive systems theory, as it's now called, and looked at how we can talk about synchronicity in that genre. And he uses a concept that has come out of chaos theory, or out of complex adaptive systems theory, called emergent phenomena. What is emergent phenomena? Well, just very briefly, consider an individual person and then consider a crowd. A crowd will have behaviors that are totally distinct from what the behavior of a single individual in the crowd would have. So at some point, the behavior of the crowd emerges from the behavior of an individual. And that's what's meant by emergence. So this is not only crowds of humans, but for example, think of starlings in flight. When does the behavior of a single starling somehow emerge, or how does it emerge from the behavior of a single starling that you get this complex behavior of a whole flock of starlings? And on and on. There are many, many examples of emergence, and what Cambray has tried to argue is that you can think about synchronicity as an example of emergence. Finally, I just want for this kind of portion of the exploration of other people's thoughts, I'll take you back to the Gaia hypothesis that came out in the 70s. That was formulated by Locke Lovelock and Margulis. Basically, the Earth and its biological systems behave as a single entity. Rupert Sheldrake wrote about morphogenetic fields, the concept of formative causation and morphic resonance. That came out in the 80s. It was also picked up by Pete and looked at closely. And most recently at UBC, Suzanne Simard has looked at trees and the relationship that trees have with each other, the kinship relations that trees actually form with each other and their genetic relatives through the root structure and then their exchange of chemical messaging. All of this is not synchronicity in a proper sense, but it is part of the connectedness that is now emerging in discussions in biology. Okay, we've looked at those 4 waves of research, and my first 4 bullet points have been touched upon, but the last one, that of a notion of a psychophysically neutral language, has not been touched upon. So we need to go into that and see why that has been the case. Let me go back to Pauli and a dream that he had. This was in that unpublished dream that he gave to Jung. He had returned to Zurich at the end of World War II, or just after World War II. And he has this dream, and first he dreams of an egg. And then he dreams of the egg dividing into 2, and it's 2 eggs. Then he dreams of a blue egg somehow emerging from the other 2. And then a 4th egg, another blue egg. So he's got 4 eggs. And he then, in the context of the dream, relates that to a formula in mathematics, which he felt had this structure, and this egg-like structure called up this formula. And what is this formula about? Well, I'll just say briefly, it is a formula that relates to something called imaginary numbers. And that will become a big deal for Pauli later on. So he's already having dreams about imaginary numbers. And he associates it with the axiom of Maria, prophetessa. You've probably heard this. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and out of the 3rd comes the 1 is the 4th. So that's an alchemical axiom, so to speak, from a medieval alchemist that sort of resonates with his dream. We will find more resonance later on in an active imagination that Pauli develops. We'll look at this in soon. It is a gift given to Pauli by his anima, and let me just point to this symbol down here. That is something that, in a visual sense, gives you a sense of what imaginary numbers can be visualized to be. It's a lovely mandalic quaternic cross-like structure. Okay. Now, Jung had been poking at Pauli to explore whole numbers as archetypes, natural numbers as archetypes, as part of Pauli's exploration of a psychophysically neutral language. He poked once in 1950 and then again in 1953. And Pauli says, "Oh, I've got to go to the US for a while. Let me get back to you about that." But he never does discuss it with Jung. Still in 1955, Jung will poke at him and say, "Look at the number as archetype." But Pauli never does, never looks at number archetypes. So towards the end of his life, Jung takes his notes that he's gathered on the archetype of numbers, and he hands that little piece of paper to Marie-Louise von Franz, and says, I'm too old to be able to write this now, so I'll hand it over to you. So she does take it, and she does take it up. So I need to talk a little bit about who she is and what she did with that little piece of paper. This is Marie-Louise von Franz. This is her mother, Suzanne. She was a German. Father, Baron Erwin Gottfried von Franz. He was an Austrian, and they um, fled Austria at the fall of Austria-Hungarian Empire at that end of World War I. So they went to Switzerland, to Zurich, or to the outskirts of Zurich, and they lived there from the time that von Franz, Marie-Louise von Franz, was about 3 years old. You can see a photo of her, the younger girl, with the older sister, Marie-Anne. And so they lived in Rheineck, about an hour away from Zurich. Marie-Louise and her sister would both go to high school where language and literature were specialized in. And they had very little money. Life was not easy. When she was 18 years old, she was walking through the woods bowling, and she met Jung. And they must have had quite a conversation. So, even as an 18-year-old, she was very much intrigued by him, and she began her studies at the University of Zurich. She would attend his lectures for the next 2 years, go up to the ETH to watch lectures up there as well. And by the time she was 19, she began having an analysis with Jung. And the next year, 1935, she would actually begin using Jungian concepts to analyze fairy tales. That was the beginning of her work on fairy tales that continued along for another 9 years. She would attend his psychological seminars and get deeply into Jungian psychology. Now, by 1937, she would have been, 22 years old at that time. Jung asked her to come along with them to an Aranis conference. And so she drove along with Tony Wolff and Jung, and they went to Aranis. And you can see she was already, as a young woman, deep into the discussion. I want to just put the foot on the brakes of the tour bus just for a second here. Look at the picture on the right, and look at the intensity that is in that picture of two people, I would say deeply mutually respectful of each other. Jung, he would be almost 60 or more, he'd be more than 60 at that time. And she's just a young woman, 22, but look at the regard that they had for each other. So she would leave academia and go to the consulting room. In 1939, she receives Swiss citizenship, receives her PhD in 1940, becomes an associate member of the psychological club in 1941. She discusses with Jung, and he says, you should go ahead and become an analyst. And she does. At the age of 27, she's an analyst. She's a member of the psychological club. By 1944, becomes a librarian there. Her father would die at that time, and that really had severe consequences for herself and her mother and her sister. Mother sells a house. Marie-Louise moves into a small room in Zurich. By 1946, she's 31, and circumstances are not good. So Jung suggests that she move in with Barbara Hanna into a house that they would share. They would live there for the next 40 years together. Barbara Hanna was 25 years older and somewhat of a mother figure for von Franz. Okay, so what did von Franz do with Jung's notes? She wrote, after 10 years of work, she wrote Number and Time. And there's so much here. We could just spend weeks on this, but I just really I want to wrap up this little bit here by quoting uh, two paragraphs from that book that are going to be significant in the discussion that follows. She would write, numbers then take typical psychological patterns of motion about which we make the following statements. One comprises wholeness, two divides, repeats, and engenders symmetries, three centers the symmetries and initiates linear succession, and four acts as a stabilizer by turning back to the one as well as bringing forth observables by creating boundaries and so on. Then later on in the book, she writes, natural numbers appear to represent the typical universally recurring common motion patterns of both psychic and physical energy. Because of these motion patterns, numbers are identical for both forms of energy. The human mind can, on the whole, grasp the phenomena of the outer world. Now, look what I've underlined there, patterns of motion, motion patterns. And what I'm pointing to there, this is not number as understood as a natural number or as an integer, and it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, even though she gives them the name 1, 2, 3, 4. This is something with a dynamism, with energy, a pattern of motion, and this is a huge, huge issue that now will come up with the further development of number archetypes. So I'm going to take a break there. Again, another 5-minute break. So why was it that Pauli didn't take up Jung's hints about natural numbers? Well, he just refused to, and he didn't say anything about that I've been able to find. But I think I understand what happened. I will speculate about what I think happened. Remember, Pauli went to Princeton, New Jersey, to the Institute for Advanced Study that's associated with Princeton, and during the war years. And when he got there, he arrived in 1940. And who did he meet? Well, he met Einstein, and he met several other premier intellectuals of that time. Let me just point down here to this book called Einstein's Genius Club. Here's Pauli here. This is Kurt Gödel, a genius logician. And then I've lost my little pointer. Here is Bertrand Russell, a philosopher. And of course, Einstein sits above them. They would all meet at Einstein's house. Gödel, not quite as often as the others, who would almost be there on a weekly basis, but he did come. And Pauli would have known Gödel very, very well, would have had tea and biscuits with Gödel. And they were roughly the same age, and would have had lots to talk about. Now, what would Gödel have told him? Gödel became very famous in the mid 1930s for two theorems that he published. They were called the incompleteness theorems. These are theorems that were formulated in theoretical logic, an extremely abstract, quasi-mathematical way of symbolizing logical sentences. Okay, the work on this began in the mid 1800s. Well, it even back to Leibniz's time, he was already formulating logical languages. But by the mid 1800s, logicians Peano and Frege were arguing that you could, at bottom line, you could reduce all of knowledge to statements in mathematics. And statements in mathematics could be statements ultimately in arithmetic, and statements in arithmetic could ultimately be statements formulated in logic. And so you reduce everything to an axiom system in formal logic. So they worked on that, and Russell and Whitehead worked on that, the two premier um, philosophers from the early part of the 20th century, and a mathematician named David Hilbert, all preeminent in their field. So they worked on trying to do that. And along came Kurt Gödel, and he proved these two theorems, and he said, no, you can't do that. You cannot reduce um, uh, all of knowledge, all of mathematics, all of arithmetics to number. It won't work. At least your language would have to be infinitely structured. You can't do it with a finite number of axioms that are both complete and consistent. That's the way he formulated. So he shot that whole initiative down and changed the direction of philosophy, moving it at right angles with the creation of his two incompleteness theorem. So certainly Pauli knew Gödel's work. He absolutely must have known Gödel's work, and he must have thought Gödel's work on numbers. That's essentially what we're talking about with number archetypes. What I want to do in formulating a psychophysically neutral language would not be possible using numbers, as Jung is suggesting. Now, this argument has been very beautifully developed by Robin Robertson, who is an editor at the LA Jung Institute journal, Psychological Perspective. So he goes through this in detail about how Gödel and Jung's thinking about natural numbers or integers come to an end, so to speak, for Jung's intuitions. Anyway, however, I'd like to offer a rebuttal. Remember, I was pointing at what von Franz was writing about number archetypes, and she was talking about processes. She was talking about dynamical processes, not as images as objects or things, but as something that has some inherent dynamism to it. So let's go back for just a second, because this is important, to something that Jung wrote in distinguishing what is an archetype. He says archetypal representations, images and ideas mediated to us by the unconscious, should not be confused with the archetype as such. The representations, are very varied structures which all point back to one essentially irrepresentable basic form. This irrepresentable basic form is characterized by certain formal elements and by certain fundamental meanings, although these can only be grasped approximately. So there is a difference between a representation of an archetype and an archetype as such, as he formulates it. What is Jung talking about with archetypes? He first starts in 1912 talking about primordial images, and then he moves on to dominance of the collective unconscious in 1917. He doesn't use the word archetype till 1919. And the term archetype itself has a large multi-century prehistory, which we won't go into right now. So Jung's use of the term archetype changes over the decades. He first talks about systems of readiness for action and at the same time images and emotion. And finally, the dynamical aspect emerges. He says, as well as being an image in its own right, the archetype is at the same time a dynamism which makes itself felt in the numinosity and fascinating power of the archetypal image. And then, as you know, later on in discussions of synchronicity, he talks about the psychoid nature of the archetype, located beyond the psychic sphere, and with its psychoid nature forms the bridge to matter. So somehow you can get to matter with archetypes. If you can get to matter, you can get into a biological representation of an archetype. So Anthony Stevens in the early 80s, 1982 and 85, he explored now the biological possibilities of representing archetypes with a neuropsychic center. In other words, in our own brains, how is it that we can represent archetypes? How do we have the neural structure that will call up a psychic representation of an archetype? And he then postulates or hypothesizes that we do, in fact, have some kind of center uh, in the brain that initiates, controls, and mediates the common behavioral characteristics and typical experiences of irrespective of race, culture, and creed, so common to humanity. Okay, we're getting to where we can characterize number archetypes as being related to some biological representation that allows for them to be imagined. So, what would be the criteria for a number archetype? Well, it would have to be innate. It'd be something you're born with. It would be something that would be developed over a long evolutionary history, not something that just arrives in a few hundred years, but in the evolution of humanity itself. It would have an iconic format. It would be relatively constant throughout the lifespan and be associated with various senses, and would be a domain-specific learning mechanism. So that all seems to characterize in a decent way how you would biologically represent a number archetype. Well, we're going to enter a new domain. We're going to enter hardcore science. We're going to enter hardcore cognitive science. This is Susan Carey. She is still associated with Harvard University, and she developed a notion of core systems of numerical cognition, as she called them. I read that as being something very, very close to number archetype. I think we're talking about pretty much the same thing. And when she wrote about these in her books from 2009, she would identify 3 different number archetypes, and she gave them appropriate names for cognitive science topics. Oh, the archetype, what we might call the first archetype, is something she called set-based quantification. What is that? It's a separation of a pattern from its background. It's a bracketing process that binds representations into sets. Then she would specify another one called parallel individuation, and other writers use other terms like object tracking system. The object tracking system is limited in the number associated with it. It's a small number set of 1 to 3 objects that are distinguished from a very early age, from infancy. From a newborn can actually distinguish 1 from 3 objects. By the time you're an adult, you can establish the difference between 1 and 4 objects. And I mean, let's consider you have 3 objects in front of you, and you just flashed an image of them for a tenth of a second. You have the means to distinguish whether what was flashed to you was either 1 object or 2 object or 3 object. If you're an adult, sometimes you can distinguish it's 4 object. You would not be able to distinguish 9 from 10 or onwards object, for example. The behavior of the object tracking system gets swamped by large numbers. And then the third system is called the analog magnitude system, and it's what allows you to judge larger numbers of objects. For example, a small handful of objects from a large bucket of objects. I'm being rather crude in my description, but that's what the analog magnitude system will do. Now, these are not exactly what von Franz wrote about, but uh, by the time you start gathering these together in their behaviors, they're doing what von Franz was attributing to the number archetypes. Let me just skip through these because we don't have time to go into these specifically. So there are these three core systems that have been identified, and they more or less line up with the behaviors of the first three archetypes that von Franz identified. Where's the fourth? Von Franz went to four and got, as she would say, more or less stuck at four. She couldn't move beyond it. Where's the fourth core system? Okay, now we have a love story. Yeah. Von Franz and Pauli began to meet in 1951 and on through about 1955. Pauli became somewhat enamored, more than somewhat enamored of von Franz. She's 36 at that time. He's 51. He makes his feelings known to her for the first time in a letter, which is his pattern. He's a great letter writer. He does that in January of 51. By April 51, he's saying, well, let's clarify this. Let's entertain amor celestis. In other words, celestial love rather than amor vulgaris, common love. And they will nevertheless draw closely together and spend a great deal of time. She would become his confidant, his sounding board, and inspiratrice as they explored his dreams and active imaginings, and to a certain extent hers, although I'll explain later, that record is not available. They would take long walks and share the substance of their personal lives together. Now, I'm just going to quote briefly from some very significant dreams that Pauli brought to von Franz to understand. One of them was from 1952, and this is where, again, he's still exploring his anima as she appears in the dreams. For him, she's still appearing as the Chinese woman with typical slanted eyes. He says, this woman, this animal figure, indicates a particularly holistic view, but one that is insufficiently connected with my rational ego. As a feminine anima figure, however, she's linked with emotional interest, which is accompanied by a stimulation or animation of the pairs of opposites. She sees connections other than those of conventional time. She is the bearer of psychophysical secrets. That's why she's appeared to him, he feels. Okay, so that is the way he understands her. In a dream, in a few months later, just to sketch through it briefly, the Chinese woman indicates that I should get up on the rostrum at a lecture hall and address the people, apparently to deliver a lecture. As I'm waiting, she dances rhythmically back up the steps and through the open door into the open air and back down again. This repetition of rhythmic movement has a powerful effect in that it gradually becomes a rotation movement, a circulation of light. And he's stirred to appear at the rostrum and to begin the lecture. And at that point, he wakes up. And he'll comment, he'll say, the motif of the non-yet accepted professorship seems to me very important, for it shows the resistance of the consciousness to the professorship. He's resistant to this kind of professorship. His unconscious, his anima is rebuking me, rebuking him for having kept something specific from the public, something akin to a confession that I have not accepted my appointment to give this lecture out of my conventional forms of resistance. And those conventional forms of resistance have to do with his commitment to Western scientific tradition. He's having a great deal of trouble bridging between his role as a physicist in a premier institute and as a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and then as someone who's exploring these very arcane topics and topics for these folk of synchronicity and such. Now, in 1953, Pauli goes through the process of writing an active imagination that is going to be a gift that he gives to von Franz. It's quite an extended work. It's 21 pages. A lot goes on in that, but it picks up on this same thing of him delivering a lecture to the strangers that is being required of him. He does in this dream/active imagination. He gives a lecture that has a biological subject matter having to do with the possible role of ESP of synchronicity in biochemical processes in genetic processes. He says in it that the Chinese anima figure tells me that she is carrying my child and she wants him to legitimize it. He's willing to do so. He's willing to legitimize this child that he's procreated with his anima. Pauli prepares to leave, to returns to his men's world, in other words, to the eighth epoch, to the world of physics. But he promises to return. As he is leaving, she, his anima, presents him with the ring eye and asks if he knows what it is. And he responds with a brief mathematical description. He then puts on his hat and coat and leaves, and he leaves, apparently without taking the ring. So what is the ring eye? This is the ring eye. We looked at another image of it before. This is the imagery that is associated with imaginary numbers. And it is a wonderful mandalic structure, quaternic structure, as you can see. But it also contains in a nutshell, what imaginary numbers are all about. And he didn't take this with him, although she was gifting him with it. He didn't take it. Why would he not take it? Well, he would have studied from the time he was 12 or 13 years old. He would have studied complex numbers, imaginary numbers, and this was all second nature to him. He knew perfectly well what imaginary numbers were, and he wouldn't need to take this along with him. He had it already, so to speak. Oh, well, he thought. Okay, he thought. Let's unpack this a little bit. Now, remember what an imaginary number is. Remember when you studied in school a square root of a number, like the square root of 4. Square root of 4 would be 2, or it could possibly be -2. But what would be the square root of a negative number, like the square root of -1? That doesn't make sense. What is that? If you have a number line, such as we learned in school, there's no place on that number line where a square root of a -1 would be located. And for 2 millennia, mathematicians just absolutely struggled, at first refusing to accept the possibility of the square root of a negative number, finally saying, oh, well, it's coming up again and again, but it's not possible. Descartes called it imaginary number. That's where the terminology came. It was later symbolized as a script letter I, so that's where the script I comes from. The ring I is the I is the unit imaginary. But again, where do you find that on the number line? You can't find it on the number line. It's not a real number. Remember if we look at the real numbers along the number line, they lie along the horizontal line. We could do this, and this is exactly how mathematicians finally dealt with it. They said, okay, let's put imaginary numbers along the vertical axis. Okay, so any number that would involve the square root of -1 or some multiple of the square root of -1, we'll put along the vertical axis. So here's the imaginary numbers, here's the real numbers, and they can coexist. Now, the funny thing is that when you take a real number and you multiply by by an imaginary number, it rotates it up from the real axis to the vertical imaginary axis. So you get imaginary numbers doing two things. They act as points along a line, and they also act as a process, a rotation process of rotating. So multiplying by I is a rotation process for a mathematician. And once mathematicians could do that and understand that imaginary numbers were this funny creation that could be visualized by rotation, then they could use it. They could make sense of it, and it became something commonplace to them. And they used it from about the mid 1800s on. They've been fairly comfortable with it. So how is it that this act of imagining a rotation takes place? There actually is a fourth core system of numerical cognition. Again, it is identifiable in the human cognitive apparatus that allows for mental rotation to take place. Carrie did not recognize it, but if you look at her criteria of for what constitutes a core system, it checks off all the boxes, so to speak. Mental rotation is well studied. It's innate, it has long evolutionary history, it's iconic, constant through the lifespan, is attributed to various senses and learning mechanisms, so forth. So it is a way to bring a fourth core system into the discussion, and it also brings a discussion of process into the discussion of core systems or number archetypes, so to speak. So what we've done is made a case for four core systems now of numerical cognition, and they act together. These four core systems act as a quaternio, a set of four systems that do very much what von Franz was suggesting when she talked about number archetypes as patterns of behavior. We now should move on and tell the story of how things went for Pauli. Because remember, Pauli had gone back to the ETH, gone back to the university, and had basically left his relationship with von Franz. And by the mid 55, he'd done that. His late 1955, his father, Pauli's father, had died of a weak heart. He would meet up with his very first brief wife, Käthe Deppner, when he was in Hamburg for a lecture, and he talked with her for a couple hours. And so there was some closure to that episode in his life. And by 1956, he had given up hope of bridging the realms of psyche and physics with a psychophysically neutral language. He didn't see a prospect for that. Things moved swiftly. In January 1957, New York Times front page, a basic concept in physics is reported upset in tests. How could you have a physics experiment as front page news on the New York Times? Well, this wasn't any experiment. This was an experiment where parity or the symmetry of the universe was shown to be violated. Now, Pauli was very, very much a believer, an intuitively based believer in the absolute symmetry of the universe in all respects. And so to find out that an experiment had been conducted that showed that, in fact, symmetry is violated, dynamical symmetry is violated in the behavior of the universe, was deeply, deeply shocking to him. His intuitive sense was devastated. he would make a throw-off comment that God is a weak left-hander after all, but in fact he was devastated by what had happened. Absolutely devastated. There were some other things that were going on in his personal and academic life that were also very hard for him to absorb. A bit more about this experiment. It was carried out by 3 researchers associated with Columbia University. It was called the Chinese Revolution because these folks were initially from China, though they're American citizens. So the proposal was made by Chung Dao Li from Columbia, and also Cheng-Ning Yang, who was at the Institute for Advanced Study but worked in Columbia. And then the principal experiment was Chen-Chung Wu at Columbia. And this is Chen-Chung Wu. This is the experimentalist that destroyed Pauli's intuition. Pauli would write to make the comment to Jung that I met Mrs. C.S. Wu in Berkeley in 1941 and was very impressed by her both as an experimental physicist and as an intelligent and beautiful Chinese young lady. In the meantime, she's married a Chinese and has a son. So he's conveyed that fact to Jung. The next year, Pauli is back in the lecture hall at ETH, and he develops abdominal pains in December 5th, 1958. He's admitted to the Red Cross Hospital by the 6th, and by the 15th, he's died of pancreatic cancer. There is a bit of final irony, I guess, to the end of his life. He died in room 137. Well, why does that have any significance? There's a symbolism there. There's perhaps even a synchronicity there. The number 137 is what physicists would regard as something of a magic number. Remember that first instructor advisor back at the University of Munich named Sommerfeld that he worked with when he was 18 years old. Sommerfeld had done research that revealed that there was something called a fine structure constant, in which a number 1 divided by 137 came up. And the 137 had no units associated with it. It wasn't in meters or seconds or any other physical unit. It was just this pure number. So 1 over 137. And physicists wondered, what's this all about? Why would you get a pure number showing up in a physics formula? So it was a mystery. It was a mystery. And so Pauli died in a mystery. He died in room 137. That's the end of my story for now. I hope you can see that it's not the end of the story. And as soon as that 1,000-page book that Michelle advocated for is published, you can carry on exploring that. But in fact, there's much to be explored with it as you wish. But if you have questions now, please ask away.